In 1897, the illustrator Frederick Remington was sent to Cuba by the New York Journal to cover roiling local tensions which would, in due course, lead to conflict between the United States and Spain. Upon arrival, Remington found no indication of imminent tumult. He cabled as much to the journal's proprietor, William Randolph Hearst. Hearst replied, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." This legendary and possibly apocryphal instruction is cited by way of demonstration that buccaneering tycoons have always used their media interests to influence events. But the modern tech CEOs who oversee the big social media platforms are doing something different and potentially more dangerous. In the United Kingdom in recent weeks, disinformation created and disseminated in real time in response to a rolling news story, especially on X, formerly Twitter, prompted riots. Hundreds of people will serve prison sentences because they believed something they read on X, which they felt licensed them to burn a migrant hostel, hurl bricks at police, or loot a pie shop. It is unknowable whether it would have made much difference if these woebegone dunces had known it wasn't true, but it is certain that X's owner, Elon Musk, did less than he might have to help. Musk also conducted a glitch-riddled online love-in with Donald Trump and rowed publicly with Thierry Breton, the EU commissioner responsible for enforcing the EU's Digital Services Act. Do national governments fully understand how powerful these platforms and their proprietors have become? Are we seeing a new kind of diplomacy develop to deal with them? And what should be done about the tech equivalent of a rogue state? This is the Foreign Desk.
If what happened in the UK happens again in a specific country, I can very easily see some countries making a decision, okay, that's enough. We're not having this anymore. No. Banning Twitter from your country is a very difficult thing to do given the prevalence of VPNs, but they can at least limit its reach.
Many German politicians too have the belief that in order to protect democracy, you might sometimes need to curtail speech. And this is not a recent belief, it's one that's gone back to really the foundations of West Germany at least. So it's a slightly different understanding of the relationship between free speech and democracy than say you have in the United States.
We are talking about technologies and services here that governments never really dreamed of. If you look at SpaceX and Starlink, they were the first to prove that low Earth orbit constellations work at scale. They made a successful business of doing that. So without the private sector, they wouldn't have access to these capabilities and services in the first place.
Welcome to the Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. And joining us first of all from Cork is David Gilbert, a reporter for Wired, covering disinformation and online extremism. David, let's start with the curious figure of Elon Musk, because he is the focus of so much attention this week. Is he something new, not just as a social media proprietor, but as a media baron? Governments have obviously long had to deal with important and powerful media potentates, but is he unusually disruptive?
I think he is for a couple of reasons. First, I think just the technology that he is now using and leveraging for his benefit is incredibly powerful. And obviously social media has been around for a while, but he is the first CEO of a company or a media figure, a similar media figure that we've seen over the years, who is using his own platform or his own broadcast outlet or media or newspaper to effectively push his narrative on his users or his readers or his viewers. And I think that it is coming from a couple of places. I think he is just a egomaniac and narcissist who needs attention constantly. He has rejigged the algorithm at X since he took over so that his own posts are viewed more times than anyone else. They appear in people's feeds even when you don't follow him, and everyone sees all of the stuff that he posts. It seems as if everyone believes him and everyone thinks he's right.
He has obviously allied himself explicitly with Donald Trump ahead of the US presidential election later this year. Is that something new that we've seen before? Again, various media barons have always obviously had their political favourites, but in allowing a platform as influential as X to be turned into essentially an arm of one candidate's campaign, is that necessarily any different from, I guess, an endorsement by Rupert Murdoch or William Randolph Hearst or whoever you're having yourself?
I actually think it's less impactful because I think Murdoch's ability to influence American politics is pretty much unprecedented. And while Elon Musk would like to believe that he has that power, the amount of people who use X in the US is pretty minimal. Now, I know the interview that he gave Trump got lots of media attention, but he was boasting about that it got 1 billion views or 1 billion interactions. And it's just completely unbelievable given that the amount of people who were awake at that time using Twitter were like about less than 100 million people. So I think he needs Trump more than Trump needs him at this point, because I think his platform is dying because advertisers are abandoning it en masse. And he wants Trump to return so that he can use that to lure advertisers back. Trump, on the other hand, came back to Twitter for one day, posted a few posts, did the interview, and left again and went back to Truth Social, where he has a financial stake. And he's been posting there ever since. Now, that may change next month because after, I think, September 19th, Trump can sell his shares in Truth Social. So he may just sell up, take the money, and return to X, where he does have a bigger audience. But I think ultimately the amount of influence that Elon Musk has just is nowhere near what he may think it is.
You mentioned earlier Musk's penchant for forcing his views on all users of X, not just his followers. Was that what was different about the disinformation and the amplification of it that we saw before and during the recent riots in the United Kingdom? Because it obviously wasn't the first time that disinformation on social media had real-world consequences, but was that the first time that we saw the actual social media platform personified by its proprietor actively spreading, amplifying, catalyzing the disinformation?
It's the first time I think we've seen it where it's been so obvious and it has had a massive real world impact. If you think about it, disinformation that has been around for centuries has always been happening in secret. Its goal was that people didn't find out that it was happening. But this is happening right out in the open, even though the things that are posted on X can be instantly debunked. It doesn't matter. They get tens of millions of views, especially if they're coming from Elon Musk. When he makes a mistake, he rarely admits it. He just deletes his post and doesn't correct the record. He just keeps on going. And I think it's incredibly dangerous because he is emboldening a huge army of people who have millions or tens of millions of followers who all look up to him and see him as the ideal version of themselves. Typically, these are all men, and they want to follow in his footsteps, and he's giving them this platform to do so. And that's why I think X is just such a toxic mess at the moment, especially around incidents like the stabbing in Southport, where people just weaponize those incidents for their own ends, not necessarily in the pursuit of the truth, or, well, almost never in the pursuit of truth in the case of X. So that's why I think he and his platform are so dangerous at the moment.
As far as we know, though, during these recent incidents, because they're quite a good prism through which to contemplate this phenomenon, did we see any efforts made by other platforms, whether Facebook, Telegram, to try and rein this stuff in?
Some on Facebook, some on Instagram. On TikTok, some of the accounts were taken down to varying degrees. But Telegram, where this stuff really began, like, this stuff doesn't begin on X. This stuff begins on Telegram in channels that the far right have cultivated in the UK over years, where they've built up large followings of people who are deeply radicalized at this point into kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim rhetoric. And they truly believe this worldview. And that's where we saw, in the wake of the stabbings, we saw a channel spun up, Stockport Wake Up, it was called, and it quickly got people organized and going to protest at a particular time in a particular place. Telegram took that channel down. Now, only after the damage had been done effectively, but they did take it down. And the multiple accounts that the person who created it tried to set up afterwards, the channels that he tried to set up in its place, they were all taken down as well. So they did take some action. Twitter, on the other hand, or X, pretty much did nothing. They let disinformation run riot on the platform and spread to millions of people. So while there was misinformation, disinformation on all platforms, X did the least to try and tamp it down. And when you think about it, it actually did more through its CEO or through its owner to amplify the violent rhetoric than anything else.
Is there an issue, though, that even if you do take it off Twitter or roust it from Twitter, where at least it is conducted in public, and quite a lot of the things posted on Twitter, now X, by the somewhat hard-of-thinking participants in these riots have led to their own convictions because they or their friends recorded them in the act of committing crimes, then posted it on a social network where anybody can see it. If it's not on X, doesn't it just go elsewhere where it's harder to find? I know you can't generate quite the same reach as quickly somewhere like WhatsApp, but with messages that are encrypted to end, how would you ever follow disinformation through there, never mind shut it down?
That is an issue in terms of if you got rid of X or Facebook or Instagram today, then a lot of people would kind of flee to darker corners of the internet where, as you say, there are private, there are encrypted channels where you can't really see what's going on. But I think the point is that the danger with X is that it is amplifying content from figures who are already in these channels on Telegram, and they move to X to get it to a bigger audience. So what you have is you have the people who are already radicalized in these Telegram channels moving to X, and you can see them talking about using X as a vector to spread it to the normies, as they say, the people who aren't aware of this and who are therefore hearing this, and they're hearing it over and over and over again, and they're not seeing it being debunked because none of this is being debunked in real time. And so that's the danger, I think, of having X as this unmoderated platform, is that it is a radicalization engine effectively, and they just come to believe what they're hearing.
The underpinning of this episode is the idea that some tech companies, such as X, have become so powerful and so important that states need almost to approach them as if they are other states, to have a diplomatic relationship with them. Can you foresee a situation in which, to further that analogy, a democratic state, which doesn't like to close down a social media platform, might decide that matters with X in particular have got to the point where, well, the nuclear option seems reasonable and just unplug them?
Yeah, I think that is going to happen. I think some countries will take that decision. We've seen in Brazil this week where the court is trying to force X to censor certain content on its platform, and they're threatening to pull out. So it could happen on the other side that X just decides not to operate in a certain country. But I think that just listening to, like here in Ireland, because Twitter's got its European headquarters here, it is, I guess, more liable for what's on its platform than in maybe other European countries, and definitely in the UK. So I think that if what happened in the UK happens again in a specific country, I can very easily see the pressure ratcheting up once more. And I can see some countries making a decision, okay, that's enough. We're not having this anymore, and moving to try and ban it. Now, banning Twitter from your country is a very difficult thing to do given the prevalence of VPNs and everything else, but they can at least limit its reach by forcing the mobile phone operators to remove or block the app on their networks.
David, thank you. That was David Gilbert, reporter for Wired. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. For an inside look at how tech firms engage with states, I'm joined now by Ansgar Baums, co-founder and partner of Geotech Advisory LLC and formerly in charge of government relations for tech firms Zoom and Hewlett-Packard, among others. He's also the author of an upcoming book, Tech Cold War, The Geopolitics of Technology. Ansgar, first of all, you did used to work in government relations at Zoom and elsewhere. Tell us a little bit about what that involves. What does someone working in government relations for a tech firm do all day?
Yeah, so as any other companies, tech companies are subject to regulation, right? And in a particularly complicated field, as tech is evolving very quickly, so there's a constant need of a dialogue between tech companies and governments trying to figure out what they need to regulate and what doesn't require regulation, and tech companies trying to explain of what they think how technology is actually developing, and often in a situation where companies think that they can actually solve all problems by themselves, so there's no need for regulation, while governments are a little bit skeptical. And this dialogue is ongoing, and it's a constant feature of tech companies trying to figure out in which environment they actually develop their technology. Often you're in uncharted territory, right? So new technologies are not regulated, or it's a big question actually which kind of regulation applies to them if they are on the market. So there's lots of complexity in it, and usually it's a dialogue, and sometimes it can get testy. So it is everything in between, like literally a cooperation, because both sides try to figure out best ways of doing stuff, and it can be something very contested when business interests are at stake, and then it can get ugly.
But put that way, it does sound very much like old-fashioned state-on-state diplomacy, but what kind of level do you deal with governments at? Who is your interlocutor when you're dealing with a state? Is it typically a minister, or is it somebody further down? Who do you speak to?
Depends usually on how big the problem is, on what we're dealing with. So the day-to-day business and the updating of information and the constant dialogue usually takes place more often than not with the administration rather than with members of parliament. So these are the subject matter experts who are responsible for implementing regulations. So this kind of detailed dialogue is taking place at this level. But as the importance of tech companies has grown immensely. I mean, remember Zoom during the pandemic when everyone tried to figure out how to keep an economy going, relying on tools like Zoom. You quickly have conversations, of course, also on state level and heads of state level, or think of what happened to the IT infrastructure of Ukraine at the beginning of the invasion. Then the dialogue between a CEO and a head of state becomes crucial. So this dialogue also can get very, very high level and very strategic and very political very quickly.
If we pursue that analogy further, the relationship between tech companies and states to other states, do you think the tech companies in general see nation states more as potential allies or more as likely adversaries?
So I'd say historically, if we look back at when the digital tech economy evolved in the 1990s, I think there was a broad understanding of that there's a great convergence of interests between governments and the digital economy. So it was it provided growth. It was the promise of we do things more efficiently, smarter. We can update your economy. We provide this transition into a service economy, etc. pp. And therefore there was a strong impulse for supporting the growth of the digital economy. And one of the paradigms established back then was the limited liability for digital platforms, right? So basically, Facebook is not responsible what Facebook users are putting online. That was basically enabling hyper growth in the platform economy. And the second important paradigm was that from a US perspective, US government perspective, there was an understanding that the global spread of IT is a good thing for the US, because with the spread of basically Western and US-centric IT, there come certain advantages that could be exploited, right? As we saw during the Snowden affair. But in the end, this belief that the more US tech is spread globally, the better for us, the better for democracy, etc. pp. And both paradigms, the limited platform liability and the idea that we do not want to control the dissemination, but we want to promote it, both of these ideas are now under scrutiny. The first one, we just had this hiccup with Musk and Breton, where you see that Musk arguing that any rollback of the limited platform liability established in the 1990s shouldn't be done, where Breton says, no. We have seen the negatives of hate speech, illegal content online, so we need to put more liability on the platform owners. That's one discussion. And the second discussion, of course, is about China, right? Controlling the dissemination of tech, export controls, entity bans. Should NVIDIA be able to ship high-end semiconductors to China. There's a serious trend now in the US to say the dissemination of Western technology is now becoming a problem as China is a competitor, and we need to control this dissemination. So both very different ideas to where we started just a couple of years back. Hence, the relationship between tech companies and government has changed rather dramatically over the last 10 years, I'd say.
Well, I guess we've seen an illustration of that relationship when it can manifest as conflict in recent weeks between X in particular and various European governments. And Elon Musk, X's proprietor, has reacted to that with his customary mix of defiance and petulance. If you, and I'm sure it's not something you'd want to be doing right now, but if you did work in government relations at X, what advice would you be giving Elon Musk?
So I think, I don't really want to have that job. If you have a boss who's basically doing whatever he likes at 4 o'clock in the morning, tweeting from his, I don't know, it's uncontrollable, right? So in order government relations to work in a company, you need certain rules that apply, which is even the boss cannot do anything he likes. So I think it's impossible to establish government relations at X right now. Yeah, I think, very basic rules apply, right? Insulting important politician is probably not a good idea. It's as simple as that. Even you could argue like what Breton did wasn't that smart either, right? Putting out a public letter prior to a discussion of Musk with Trump and wagging the finger by saying, we're watching you, is probably also not appropriate behavior for a EU commissioner. So probably some blame on both sides for this escalation. I think it will hurt both. Breton didn't inform his boss. There are ongoing investigations into X. I cannot imagine that Musk's behavior will help X in actually convincing the EU Commission that X is compliant to the Digital Services Act, which, there are a couple of hefty fines possible if you do not comply with it. So I wonder if that was really that smart also from a financial perspective for Elon Musk.
Ansgar Baums, thank you for joining us. That was Ansgar Baums, author of the imminent book Tech Cold War, The Geopolitics of Technology. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. For obvious reasons, Germany is more sensitive than most countries to the expression and dissemination of hate speech. Germany's Network Enforcement Act, or NetzDG, passed in 2017, was a forerunner to the EU's Digital Services Act of 2022, the latter being the basis for Elon Musk's recent row with Thierry Breton. Well, joining us now from Vancouver is Heidi Tworek, Associate Professor of International History and Public Policy and Director of the Centre for the Study of Democratic Institutions at the University of British Columbia. Heidi, first of all, I was wondering if you could explain very briskly what Germany's NetzDG law actually is and what it actually does.
The very German compound noun, the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, or NetzDG, or Network Enforcement Act, basically what it does is it enforces statutes of German speech law online. So sometimes it's known as a hate speech act, but really what it does is it enforces 22 statutes of German speech law online, some of which are, defamation, blasphemy, etc., etc. So the idea from the German perspective is that you already have speech law on the books, it's enforced offline, and it should be enforced online.
How have they gone about enforcing it online, though? Because this is a source of frustration even for people who have attempted to police hate speech online. It is the whole, I'm not even sure if whack-a-mole is the appropriate metaphor, but you press down in one part and it pops up somewhere else.
Yeah, so the way that the Germans approached this was to say that for any platform that had more than 2 million active users in Germany, that users must now have an opportunity to report what they thought was contravening one of these statutes of speech law to the platform, and the platform had to respond within 24 hours or face a fine. So this still puts the onus on users, right? It's not saying that the platform has to go out and find this stuff, but rather that if users complain, this needs to be attended to in a timely fashion. And so if the idea was if the platform doesn't do that or doesn't take down something that's illegal, the platform can be fined. And the other part of this law is that every 6 months, these platforms have to produce transparency reports where they tell us how many users have complained, were the posts taken down, why were they taken down, so under what guidelines, et cetera, et cetera.
Do we have any clear idea by now of how well this has worked? I guess the way to measure it might be to ask, is Germany's online discourse any less obviously toxic than anybody else's?
It's a great question because it's actually really difficult to figure out what are the metrics that you're going to use to answer this question, right? So one metric that the platforms are using is how much stuff is getting taken down, right? Like that's what you see in the transparency reports. But then, of course, the question is you've got a nominator, but what about the denominator? If you've got more content in general, does the actual number of how much is being taken down really tell you that much? But that's at least one metric that could theoretically be used, that stuff is being taken down. Another metric you could use is how many people are working as content moderators in German. So a big problem that the many countries have had, if they are not English speaking, is that there just aren't that many content moderators not working in English. And at least this law has spurred the employment of many more content moderators who are working in German. So you could say, okay, at least then for users who have complaints or difficulties, there are more people working in their language and in that context. A third way you could try and measure it would be to see, do we think that there's some sort of decrease in toxic discourse in some way? But that's, I would say, it's just extremely difficult to measure from a research perspective. And then finally, for a lot of people, including a lot of politicians, this was not so much in many ways about the online, but really about the offline, right? Like, do you see a decrease in offline far-right violence and neo-Nazism, which of course in Germany, given its history, is a huge question. And we might say that there things maybe don't look as promising when we look at, for example, the vote share of the AfD or adherence to groups that are perhaps interested in political violence. It's not clear that this law has had the effects that politicians might have hoped.
On that front, has there been any dispute within Germany about freedom of speech issues? Because obviously we hear in the United States from the sort of libertarian tech bros, one in particular, a somewhat fundamentalist upholding of the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech for American citizens. Not only is there not a law in the Constitution guaranteeing that in Germany, at least as far as I'm aware, but Germany does maintain, as you were suggesting, very specific strictures on some fronts, for example, against glorification of Nazism, denial of the Holocaust, etc. Given that history, have Germans generally been amenable to the idea that, maybe there are some things you just shouldn't be allowed to say in public?
Yeah, so if you looked at many of the surveys around 2017 when this law was being passed, quite a large number of Germans, depending on the survey, right, 60, 70% were pretty amenable to this kind of restriction. So basically, many German politicians too have the belief that in order to protect democracy, you might sometimes need to curtail speech. And this is not a recent belief, it's one that's gone back to really the foundations of West Germany, at least. So it's a slightly different understanding of the relationship between free speech and democracy than, say, you have in the United States. And you have, though, at the same time, had lots of critiques of this particular law. So there have certainly been journalists and others who have worried that this will curtail free speech. And they've also worried that this will lead social media platforms to over-delete. Because if you're going to be fined for doing something, then your incentive is to over-delete. And so that's been a concern from civil rights organizations in Germany and without. Certainly at the very beginning of this law, one AfD politician had a tweet deleted, and that was, of course, used to claim that lots of things were being deleted and their voice was being silenced. But as far as we can tell, the fears of over-deletion haven't really come to pass in those ways. And that part of the reason for that is actually that when you look at these transparency reports, what has happened is that when platforms are justifying why they're actually deleting these flagged posts, they're not actually saying, oh, this has been flagged and we're deleting it because it's illegal under German speech law. They're saying, oh, this has been flagged, we're deleting it because it contravenes our own community guidelines, which are laws within social media platforms. So I think that's just an interesting finding that what this law has done ultimately is given users a much more user-friendly complaint mechanism. And most of what they're flagging, platforms are finding contravenes their own internal guidelines. And there's not that many things that pass according to a platform's internal guidelines, but are illegal under NetzDG.
We're looking in this episode at the way that the big tech companies and national governments interact. And the NetzDG law has obviously informed the creation of the EU's Digital Services Act. Do you get the impression, especially given some of the rhetoric we have heard from the EU directed towards the former Twitter, now X in particular, that the EU is actually steeling itself for a showdown with the social media platforms, in particular the American social media platforms, and that one in particular, saying either seriously get with the program or we will pull your plugs?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can certainly see the ways in which NetzDG informed the Digital Services Act, but I think you can also see how the Digital Services Act learned from the problems of NetzDG as well. So the Digital Services Act is not a carbon copy of NetzDG on a European level. So there's much deeper thought about things like, for example, transparency and data access for researchers. How do you make codes of conduct? I think some sort of serious reckonings with those critiques around freedom of expression that we talked about. So that then, of course, reflects then back onto the German level, because now the DSA has to be implemented on the German level. Whether the EU is steeling itself for a showdown, I mean, I think we'll see. And we've already seen not just investigations launched into X, but also into TikTok. So I think while we talk about it as being a sort of EU versus X, because that's the loudest dispute, there's actually a bunch of others going on. The other thing that I just say is that we tend to focus on the DSA because it's the content stuff, etc., and that's, you know, much more interesting in some ways. But at the same time, there was a launch of the Digital Markets Act, which is looking at questions of competition. And if we're really thinking about what's going to change the fundamentals of platforms, things like antitrust or competition are probably more fundamental, just maybe for some of us less interesting. But I think we've got to keep an eye on that, just like we've got to keep an eye on the antitrust suit that just found against Google in the US.
If we're trying to summarize the dynamic between them just finally, do you think it is fair to say that maybe the social media platforms, and that one in particular, have tended to overestimate their power, whereas perhaps in relation to this, governments have underestimated theirs?
It's a really interesting way of putting it. I mean, I think you're right in the sense that governments have been more hesitant to regulate social media platforms for quite some time than they were prior technologies like radio or television, which were much more regulated from the start. And I guess what I would say is that some social media platforms have called for regulation, right, at various moments, whether it was Mark Zuckerberg or others. But one, of course, has to be a little bit skeptical of whether they're calling for regulation that suits them, because there's also a type of regulation that perversely entrenches the major platforms as they currently exist. So I think that's a dynamic to watch out for as well. And then the final thing that I would say is that, you know, we frame this as social media platforms and government, but that leaves out this huge group, which is the users themselves. And that, I think, can often be a flaw of these sort of clashes between government and platforms. Like, well, what about all the people who want to use them, or civil society? What are their opinions? What do they want to see, and what would they hope for? And how could we incorporate more of that in regulation?
Heidi Tworek at the University of British Columbia, thank you for joining us here on the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. It would be churlish to suggest that all of Elon Musk's vast influence has been baneful. The Starlink satellite internet service of Musk's SpaceX company has been invaluable to Ukraine as it has sought to fight off Russia. But is it strange that the supply of such strategically vital infrastructure is left to the whim of eccentric billionaires? Well, joining us now is Clayton Swope, Deputy Director of the Aerospace Security Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Swope previously led national security and cybersecurity public policy for Amazon's Project Cooper. Clayton, I wanted to start by getting a kind of benchmark of the capabilities we're talking about. Are there realms in which private tech companies actually have superior capacity to those of states, even indeed the United States?
We're talking about technologies and services here that governments never really dreamed of. These are things that private sector innovation has brought to the table. If you look at SpaceX and Starlink, they were the first to prove that low Earth orbit constellations work at scale. They made a successful business of doing that. I think I've read they have about 3 million customers right now. So without the private sector, the public sector, governments, they wouldn't have access to these capabilities and services in the first place, and neither would consumers or businesses.
So could the United States, for example, have furnished Ukraine with Starlink, or at least something like Starlink, even if it had wanted to?
Starlink is a commercial product. It's a service that's designed really as simple as to connect you to the internet. And it's not that much different than a mobile phone network operator. In this case, it's using satellites in space and not cell towers on Earth. In the case of the US government, generally they have a policy not to create a government capability that's going to compete with a US company, thinking that the best outcome is really for the government to buy that commercial product.
But where tech of the sort we're talking about, this extraordinarily sophisticated stuff, which really can direct the tides of history, if you like, are there risks to that sort of thinking? Because we are seeing reports, as you'll be aware, of black market dealers selling Starlink kit to Russians in Ukraine and indeed the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, among others. And I mean, I think it's a commonplace of history that innovation and technology tend to outrun attempts to regulate it. But again, with these particular technologies, does that strike you as potentially dangerous?
I think if I'm looking at this from a standpoint of a company, I'm thinking about my business concerns. I'm thinking about reputational concerns. I'm maybe worried about a government stepping in with new laws or regulations. And just generally, if I'm a company, I don't want to see my product used for nefarious purposes. So there is the risk of that misuse. But companies are likely pretty willing to work with authorities to minimize the chance of those products and services falling into the wrong hands, if only for their own self-interest.
But do you think it has got to the stage, though, to a degree, again, that we have not experienced in the past? There's always been powerful corporations. There's especially always been powerful corporations involved in communication who have the ability to shape politics. But have we really reached the stage at which some of those companies are actually, in many respects, as powerful as the governments of major countries?
It's not the first time that business leaders have been in position where they're making decisions with geopolitical impacts, or even when business leaders shared strong geopolitical views. I'm thinking back to Henry Ford. He was a vocal anti-war critic before and during the first few years of World War I. But then as eventually his company became a major weapons manufacturer for the war. So he had those views at the start that really had little to do with the direction of his business in the long run. But if we're talking about influencing or shaping the behavior of a company, one that is very influential, one that isn't influential, but with a goal of shaping what they do, it's worth just thinking about what the goals are. What does the government really want to see out of companies? What are the possible consequences and downsides of those actions? Because really, you think about government action could impact a company's ability to innovate. Does it hurt their competitiveness? There's a lot of talk in the US about competitiveness of US companies and US writ large with China. How does it affect that? How does the government shaping behavior of a company through laws, regulation, contractual relationships, how does that impact domestic jobs in the US? How does that impact economic growth? All of these things could be consequences of government action, but certainly the government does have tools that could influence what a company does.
Do you think that we are at a point at which we are likely to see, though, governments making more use of those tools?
I think if we look at space specifically, space is different in some ways than other tech companies because space exists outside of national boundaries. There are a lot of things that happen in space that are covered by just really one main international treaty and a few treaties off of that. How do governments work together? How do they work independently, really to ensure a safe space environment, a sustainable space environment, tackle some of these issues that you're talking about? We're just on the cusp of figuring out what those even problems look like, what those challenges are, and we're probably a long way off really to coming up with governance frameworks that really tackle all these things that we're seeing now because of advances in technology. More and more satellites operate in orbit. Just with Starlink alone, there's 6,000 satellites right now. There's thousands more planned. There's 3 large Chinese constellations planned, thousands of satellites each. There's going to be a lot of questions about how we govern that area, which does exist and looks a lot different than what happens within national boundaries. If anything, it looks more like the high seas for maritime traffic, international aviation, maybe a place like Antarctica. But those aren't one-for-one parallels. So outside of even just other tech issues, space has its own unique challenges that we're just getting acquainted with, and it's going to be a long time before we really figure out how to solve those.
Does a company like X have the advantage that it's not constrained in the way that the defense sector is, that it can deal directly with Ukraine rather than having to go through the US government?
This isn't the first time companies have had to make decisions that have geopolitical impacts. I think about situation in Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. A lot of US companies, a lot of European companies left. I mean, thinking something like McDonald's. Different types of companies, though, than I think tech companies that we're talking about. maybe it's not necessarily that we have this issue with companies that are making business decisions that ultimately have geopolitical impacts. It's more a perception that companies are making geopolitical decisions that are somewhat independent of business interests. So it may be driven more by opinions. That ability there, that's something maybe new that we're starting to see that we haven't necessarily always seen. I kind of go back to the Henry Ford example, though, where there was a similar trend there. But if anything, I feel like that's kind of where the public is focused on right now.
Clayton Swope at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, thanks for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email chris@cc@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.